Yu-Gi-Oh! Is an incredible game, and I've been playing for almost 20 years at this point. I'm drawn to its balanced complexity and limitless options, and despite the hundreds of little things you can do differently in each game, every small action makes a difference, and oftentimes, skillful choices will prevail. A lack of barriers in deck construction will also let creativity flourish, and innovators are frequently rewarded. All of these things combined are a mere fraction of the elements in Yu-Gi-Oh! That I love. But there's one thing in Yu-Gi-Oh! That I absolutely detest. In Yu-Gi-Oh! The way you interact with your opponent can be classified into 3 categories. A removal effect that'll kill your opponent's monsters, a negation effect that'll stop your opponent's abilities, or a floodgate effect that'll restrict the actions your opponent is allowed to make. As of late, the Yu-Gi-Oh! Community has been rallying against negates, and with the banning of Baron de Fleur and Warlord Savage Dragon, it seems like we are trending to a future with a lot less of these type of abilities. But while an abundance of negates in the game creates an unfun environment, this isn't my biggest problem with the game. Floodgates, a whole other form of interrupt the community has been crusading against, has a specific subset within the classification that is truly the scourge of this game. Lingering floodgates, a type of effect that restricts the opponent's actions for a set amount of time. These cards activate their effects and then cannot be interacted with for the duration of the restriction. This means if a lingering floodgate is a monster and you'd use its ability, but then is later killed in battle or by card effects, the restriction still applies. It does not go away. It is in place for the entirety of the duration that it lists. And I think that is just ridiculous. So this isn't something that's been away from the public eye. People have talked about these cards quite a bit, and many have been banned, but I still think there are a lot of criminal cards that the game would be a lot better without existing. Some very big common ones you may see in Yu-Gi-Oh! Right now are cards like Dimensional Barrier, Dimension Shifter, Joel and Lockbird. How about Hot Red Dragon, Archer Fiend, King Calamity? That one's a tongue twister, but also terrible. Or Gimmick Puppet Nightmare. If you sat across from these cards in the last bit, you've probably been pretty frustrated. And if you're not playing TCG, well, Master Duel has more of them. You could have been Max Seed. You could have been Red Rebooted. You could have been Artifact Scythed. None of these cards are fun to play against. And I don't get it, because in many cases, these cards have such very limited counterplay. The ability to interact with them is so little. A card like Dimensional Barrier is so hard for you to play around, because if you go second and your opponent flips it on you, and your deck is Mono Synchro, Mono Exceed, or Mono Fusion, or AS Mono Ritual as well, you have almost nothing you could do. In other Floodgate cases, like Summon Limit or Anti-Spell Fragrance or Skill Drain, which I'm not really advocating for either here, but I still think they're better than these cards. Barring Anti-Spell Fragrance, you could have back removal like Lightning Storm, like Harpy's Feather Duster, that'll kill the Floodgates, and you'll get past it no problem. Part of the problem in the past was backing those Floodgates up with negates meant that wasn't a viable strategy, but if negates aren't going to be in the game as much, then that's not a big of a problem. However, a card that doesn't need to stay on the field means those don't work. And in many cases, the cards that exist in these Floodgate forms don't have a lot of pre-existing ways that you can interact with them. Now, some cards have some interactability, and that is the only merits to a card like Gimmick Puppet Nightmare existing, is that there are so many moving pieces in the Despia combo to resolve Nightmare that maybe it is justifiable and there's enough counterplay against it that it's worth doing. But again, go back to Dimension Barrier or Dimension Shifter. Those come down either in your draw phase on turn 1 or turn 2. The amount of cards that can answer that are close to 0. It's not many. You guys tell me how many ways to beat Barrier or Shifter there are. I'd be surprised if you come up with over 10, let alone like 3 viable ones. Like Call By and Crossout are like the extent. Those don't feel good. If your deck has weaknesses to cards, you have to put cards in for Crossout just to stay alive. That's not great, but it's something, I guess. The thing is here, shutting off an entire avenue of play in a turn is only big if Konami designs decks that only take one avenue of play, but it happens to be the case very often. You know, I guess could be a whole other design point Konami may have to look at in the future, but I think it'd be a lot easier just to remove these cards that are overbearingly restrictive from the game in general. Dimensional Barrier is obviously one of the worst offenders in this case, because being a trap card is probably the least interactable out of all of them, as well as shutting off an entire summoning type and effect for the whole turn means that entire archetypes crumble, especially when some of the restrictions Konami's been giving to decks is locking them into their extra deck summoning method for the turn, which, like, I get you want to stop them from being these crazy combo decks, but then why does a card like this exist that now gives silver bullets to every single deck to counter yours? And not just like silver bullets that now you have to prepare for, silver bullets you can't do anything about. Cards like Dimensional Barrier are so bad that it is the reason I almost never play a deck that is weak to Dimensional Barrier. But Dimensional Barrier isn't alone. Another big one that I really hate, and I guess it's a little more interactable, is Abyss Dweller, a card I've ranted about nonstop. And this one appeals more to me because thankfully people don't always play it that much, and 2 level 4 monsters being required for summon makes it not as generic as something like Dimensional Barrier. But as someone who enjoys combo decks and graveyard based decks, staring down this is a pain in the ass because you still can't interact with it that easily. You could only interact with quick play spells. So you were limited to, I guess now Metal Tronus, but before Forbidden Chalice and Forbidden Droplet. And then maybe there's some counterplay mind games with Infinite Impermanence versus Kaiju where you could try get them with those, though neither were foolproof plans and usually weren't worth the spot playing because they weren't foolproof. And given that you just had so few options, there was still a decent chance that the Dweller would resolve against you. And if your deck needed graveyard effects, which is a lot of decks, you just couldn't do anything. There's the finals where I got Dwellered 4 times in a row. It sucks, man. It sucks. And now Tier was powerful enough that there were other ways to play outside of the grave, which sounds crazy as a Tier player, but it was true. I would rather play without a graveyard in Tier Elements than Unchained. My biggest fear playing Unchained after the release of Rescue Ace was now there was a viable deck that could Abyss Dweller me. And now I felt like, despite my deck seemingly have a good matchup in most regards, if I went second and they knew to Dweller me, I was just boned. And that was a big turnoff for the end half of 2023 for me. I felt like the Rescue Ace Unchained matchup was pretty favorable to Unchained if it wasn't Dwellered. But the second Dweller is put into equation, it feels 50-50. But the thing to note here is, on the topic of Dweller, people have stopped talking about it. You know, go back to Tier format, and this card was on people's radar as a card that could potentially get banned because its overbearing presence on that format was very noticeable. And while in specifically Tier format, it's arguable that it kept it in check and it was actually healthy for the game, in most cases, that's not going to be the case. Tier was the exception because it was so ridiculously powerful that it could bypass the overbearing effects and you couldn't use your graveyard, despite graveyard being the main aspect of Tier Elements. And I think a card like this existing will just keep popping up from format to format, being something that is very much a problem. We've seen Dweller pop up time and time again as something that is not fun to play against. If you were Salad vs. Orcust, this was like a defining card in the matchup in 2019 that was really not easy to deal with, and you had limited ability to play around, that it begs the question, why does this card need to exist? There could be something better than that. I'd rather there was graveyard removal, rather. Cards like Melodious Schuberta are really cool. They can be crippling to graveyard decks, but if your opponent is able to layer their plays effectively, they could maneuver around something like Schuberta or like DD Crow or Bestials. But Dweller is just blanket, you have nowhere to go. You can't attack over it first and then play main phase 2. You can't try and force it out and then play afterwards. You really just need to draw in your opening 6 the answer to it. And the problem here is that these exist for several different functions in Yu-Gi-Oh! And they all need to go. Artifact Lancia is another example of a lingering floodgate that says you cannot banish for the turn. And like Shifter, it's almost no counterplay. You need Call by the Grave. And that's almost it in terms of how you can stop it. And though we don't see right now a big banish deck, imagine if every single card in your deck as a cost required you to banish like the top card of your deck face down. Would that deck just be unplayable? Or would that deck automatically just have like a 33% loss factor anytime this card was being played against them or an opponent's deck? It's almost like the Ash Banded Fusion thing, except more real because you have no counterplay. Now, Konami could design decks that don't have weaknesses to the lingering floodgates that exist, but that's almost impossible considering there's lingering floodgates for almost every aspect. Even Link Summoning now has Simul Archifiends, which is pretty specific in what it does, so it hasn't been a problem yet. It's not very future-proof. There's cards that stop Graveyard, like Dimension Shifter, Different Dimension Ground, Silent Graveyard. There's cards that stop Extra Deck, like Dimensional Barrier as well. There's cards that stop Whole Effects, period, like Calamity, All Summoning, period, like Gimmick Puppet. Cards that stop Searching, like Droll and Mistaken Arrest. There's cards that stop Banishing, like Artifact Lancia. There's just so many. It's likely it took the effect of Threatening Roar and said, okay, sure, Battle Phase isn't too important in Yu-Gi-Oh! Let's make Threatening Roar good and make it stop everything else. And that's what all these other cards are. And I just don't see the reason why it should persist. And while we have cards on the ban list that clearly have lingering floodgate effects, Konami has also kind of been going in the opposite direction with his last ban list. So 8 cards currently are banned in the TCG with lingering floodgate effects. I already talked about Artifact Scythe and Maxi being some, because those are still legal in Master Duel. Same with Red Reboot. Cold Wave is another one that is banned. Utopic Zexel, which couldn't interact with. As I thought, one of the dumbest one ever is because it just happened. That one didn't even activate. It just said, haha, you lose. True King of all calamities. Who doesn't love the card that says you can't play the game? And Shockmaster, another card that is just awesome. And then one card was banned and just came back. And that is Arch Nemesis Protoss. And while I'm ranting about Dweller needing to get banned and all that, this card is kind of what launched me off into this tangent, because now this has come off the list. If you're not familiar with Protoss, let me give you a quick rundown. You summon it by banishing 3 monsters with different attributes from your grave and interface of fields. It cannot be destroyed by card effects, and then once per turn you can declare a monster attribute in the field to destroy all monsters on the field with that attribute. And then here's the kicker. Also, until the end of the next turn, so not even this turn, the next turn, neither player can special summon monsters with that attribute. Once it resolves, you're boned. If your deck is limited to 1 attribute, which is like so many decks. So how is Konami supposed to plan around building an archetype that's limited to a single attribute, right? Like, that's not going to happen for every single attribute. So every single deck that's mono attribute now will have a weakness to this card in the future, as long as it's still unbanned. Now you may say, okay, it's at 1. Why is this the problem? Well, it's searchable. You can search it with Nemesis Flag, meaning Flag is searchable via Bonfire versus Sprint and then Promethean Princess getting it back, which is not too hard. You can get it off of Banshee getting a Flag. You can also do a Sword Soul Chi-Shao, which gets Sword Soul Emergence, which gets Protoss. Point being, when you want to get this card, it is fairly easy to do so. And while it might not see play at the very moment, with Yu-Gi-Oh! And as a deck builder, you always want to be very forward-thinking, thinking into the potential of the future. And as someone who's not a huge fan of handshake formats, I'm looking to a future of the game where I can return to playing high engine counts and relying on the cards in my archetype to be problem solving and to play through fields. Most decks won't have an in-house ability to beat Lingering Floodgates. So if I'm getting Protoss, it kind of tells me like maybe the way that I love playing Yu-Gi-Oh! Just will always be invalidated. Now Protoss won't always exist in the game and won't always be a viable option, which is like some help, but there's just so many Lingering Floodgates that it's kind of concerning that while these omni-gates need to get banned, so do these. And now, one of the fun things about Protoss here is we can talk about how the monster versions of the Lingering Floodgates are maybe a little more manageable because there are more interaction points with them. Protoss is used on the prior turn. So unlike something like King Calamity or the Albion Sanctifier and the Puppet Nightmare play, which you can interact with on the turn it's happening, or Dweller even, you have to Veiler or Imperm Protoss essentially, because once your turn comes, it's already in effect. You can't have Forbidden Chalice or Droplet now. And that's just crazy. Like, that's level of Shockmaster. A card that's been banned for almost a decade at this point, right? And for good reason. Because, like, if by that logic, Protoss is okay to exist, Shockmaster, which is similar in requiring a bit of setup to make, but albeit makeable, and albeit somewhat interactable, that should be legal too. And please, don't get this as me advocating for Shockmaster. Like, even if these aren't the biggest problems in each format, there will be formats where these cards always pop up, because they maybe are too specific in what they do. But when they do pop up, they're never a good thing. They're almost always for the detriment of the health of the game. And I think Yu-Gi-Oh! Would be a lot better if what is ultimately the worst part of Yu-Gi-Oh! In my opinion would just be erased. And I know this would mean a rather large banning for some of these cards. Cards like Silent Graveyard, which haven't really been too playable because there are just better alternatives. I think that is still the right course of action. So let me know what you guys think. If there's a part of Yu-Gi-Oh! That you guys really hate, I'm curious to see as well, because my fixation on combo decks is a large reason why this specifically is the biggest element of Yu-Gi-Oh! I dislike. So I'm wondering if you have a different playstyle, if there's a different part of Yu-Gi-Oh! That you also really don't want to see. And also let me know if any of the points I made you didn't agree with, or if I missed anything on top of those. If there are any other lingering floodgates that have really caused you a problem and I just glanced over them or mentioned them at all, then share your sob stories with me. I will be the shoulder for you to cry on. Anyways, if you want to see more discussion videos about Yu-Gi-Oh! In a more broad sense, then I can do that as well. Just let me know with a like, subscription, and a comment down below supporting it. Anyways, I'll see you all next time. Peace.